He stared at the deed, the paper crinkling in his weathered hands. Then he stared at the farmhouse. A farmhouse that was supposed to be empty. But it wasn't empty. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a lazy gray ribbon against a brilliant blue sky. 3 healthy-looking horses stood tied to a fence post, their tails flicking at flies. And a line of laundry, shirts, dresses, undergarments, flapped in the breeze, stretched between 2 ancient oak trees. This wasn't right. Wade Langston had paid good money, every last cent he had in the world, for a deserted property. The man at Frontier Bank, a nervous fellow named Harrison with shifty eyes, had sworn on a stack of Bibles that no one had lived here for a decade, said the previous owners just vanished into thin air. Wade urged his tired horse, Bess, forward. A knot of confusion in his gut was slowly tightening into irritation. The closer he got, the more signs of life he saw. A vegetable garden, meticulously tended, flourished near the house, bursting with ripe tomatoes and green beans. A flock of chickens pecked and scratched at the ground inside a sturdy wire pen. Fresh tire tracks from a wagon marked the dirt path leading right up to the front porch. This wasn't an abandoned farm. This was a home. Before he could even swing his leg over the saddle to dismount, the front door creaked open. A woman stepped out onto the porch. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her hands were planted firmly on her hips. She was beautiful in a fierce, untamed sort of way, but her expression held absolutely no welcome. It was a look that could curdle milk. Then behind her, 2 more women appeared in the doorway, like shadows taking form. One a redhead with a sharp, calculating gaze, the other a blonde with wide, worried eyes. They were all striking, and they were all looking at him as if he were a rattlesnake that had just slithered into their kitchen. "You're on private property," the first woman called out. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut across the yard with an unmistakable authority. Wade, feeling a surge of defensiveness, held up the deed in his hand like a shield. "Ma'am, I think there's been some confusion. I bought this place, fair and square, from Frontier Bank just 3 days ago. Got the papers right here to prove it." The woman's eyes, the color of moss in a deep forest, narrowed to slits. "Is that so?" She moved with a fluid grace, stepping down from the porch. Her sisters fanned out behind her, flanking her like a personal guard. They moved as one, a silent, intimidating unit. "Well, I'm Ruby Callahan, and this here," she swept her arm out to encompass the house, the barn, the field stretching to the horizon, "is my family's land. Has been for 20 years. 20 years? The word caught in Wade's throat. 20 year, his voice cracked. That's not possible. The bank told me it was abandoned. For over a decade. They said the previous owners just up and left." He felt a cold dread begin to seep into his bones. The bank manager's nervous fidgeting suddenly made a lot more sense. Ruby stopped just 10 feet from his horse, close enough that he could see the fire blazing in her green eyes. She wasn't angry. She was furious. "The bank told you a lot of things, didn't they, mister?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But let me tell you what they didn't. We never left. We never sold. And we sure as hell didn't abandon our home." The younger sister, the blonde, whispered something urgent to Ruby. The middle sister, the redhead, kept her hand hovering near something tucked into her belt. Wade didn't need to see it to know it was a gun. His mind was a whirlwind. He had spent every dollar from his army pension, every cent he'd saved working the rail lines on this one piece of land. It was his dream. The deed was legitimate. He'd had the clerk at the courthouse check it twice. But these women, they weren't squatters. You could see it in the way they stood, in the fierce pride in their eyes. They belonged here. They were rooted to this soil. "Look, ladies," he started, trying to keep his voice calm and steady, trying to be the voice of reason in a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of his control. "I don't want any trouble, but I have a legal document. It says this farm, this house, this land, it belongs to me now. Maybe we can just sort this out, peaceful-like." Ruby let out a laugh, but it was a harsh, bitter sound with no humor in it. "Peaceful? You ride onto our land waving a piece of paper from the very snakes who've been trying to drive us out, and you expect us to just pack up our lives and leave?" She gestured wildly toward the house, her anger palpable. You see that garden? My sister Clarabelle planted every seed with her own hands. Those repairs on the roof? My sister Sadie and I nailed every shingle ourselves. That new corral behind the barn? We built it last spring. Her voice rose with every word, a crescendo of righteous fury. We've been living here, working this land, keeping it alive while that fancy bank office sat empty in town, cooking up ways to steal it from us. Wade felt sweat break out on his forehead, a cold sheen despite the cool morning air. Something was desperately, horribly wrong here, and the sickening suspicion that he was the fool in this equation, the pawn in someone else's game, was growing stronger by the second. But before he could even form a response, before he could try to defend the piece of paper that had cost him everything, Ruby reached into the pocket of her worn dress. She pulled out a folded document, her movements slow and deliberate. Because we've got papers too, stranger, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. And I'll wager ours are a whole lot older than yours. Ruby unfolded her document with the deliberate slowness of a poker player revealing a winning hand. Her eyes never left Wade's face, challenging him, daring him to dispute what she was about to show him. The paper was yellowed with age, its creases worn soft and thin from years of handling. She held it up, and even from his position on horseback, Wade could make out the ornate, swirling script and the official-looking seal at the bottom, pressed into a splotch of dark red wax. This here, Ruby said, her voice cutting through the morning quiet like a razor, is the original deed to this property, signed over to our father, Thomas Callahan, by the territorial governor himself 24 years ago. Our father broke this land. He built this house with his own two hands. He's buried on that hill over yonder, under the big oak. She pointed a resolute finger toward a gentle rise behind the barn. Now, mister, how old did you say your paper was? Wade's stomach plummeted. It felt like he'd swallowed a cannonball. 3 days. His deed was 3 days old. But that didn't make a lick of sense. You couldn't sell property that already belonged to someone else. It was the most basic law of the land. Unless the bank had somehow foreclosed. But Ruby had said they never sold, never left. His thoughts raced back to the bank, to Mr. Harrison, the manager, the way the man's eyes had refused to meet his, the way he'd rushed through the paperwork, glossing over the fine print, and his strange insistence on a cash payment only. No drafts, no banknotes, just cold, hard cash. At the time, Wade had thought it was just small-town eccentricity. Now it felt sinister. That's impossible, Wade stammered, but his voice lacked any real conviction. He sounded like a man trying to convince himself. Frontier Bank is a legitimate business. They wouldn't sell me stolen property. The middle sister, the redhead with the sharp gaze, finally stepped forward. She let out a bitter, scornful laugh that grated on Wade's nerves. Legitimate? That's Sadie, Ruby said, with a nod toward her sister. And she's got some interesting stories about just how legitimate that bank really is. Sadie's eyes, a shade of blue so pale they were almost silver, blazed with a cold fire. You want to know about legitimate? 3 months ago, a man from that same bank, probably the same Mr. Harrison who smiled so sweetly at you, came riding out here. He claimed we owed years of back taxes, said if we didn't pay up, they'd foreclose and seize the property. Wade felt a flicker of something. Maybe this was the explanation. So you paid them? We paid them nothing, Sadie snapped, because we showed him this same deed, the one my sister's holding. We proved we own this land, free and clear. There are no taxes owed on property that was never mortgaged in the first place. It's ours. Always has been. The youngest sister, Clarabelle, who had remained silent and trembling in the background until now, finally spoke up. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Wade lean in to listen. That man, he wasn't happy. That's Clarabelle, Ruby explained, her tone softening slightly as she looked at her younger sister. And she saw something that day, something that might interest you. Clarabelle's hands twisted the fabric of her apron as she spoke, her gaze fixed on the dirt by her feet. After the bank man left, I was worried. He was so angry. I followed him, just for a little ways, keeping to the trees. He stopped at Miller's trading post before he got back to town. He met another man there, a man in a fancy suit I'd never seen before. She looked up, her worried eyes meeting Wade's. They were laughing, and I heard the bank man say, clear as day, "Don't you worry. Give it 3 months. We'll have buyers lined up for that Callahan property, one way or another." The ground seemed to shift beneath Wade's feet. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place, and the picture they were forming was ugly. You're saying the bank planned to sell your land out from under you, even after you proved you owned it? We're saying a lot more than that, Ruby replied, her voice grim. She refolded the old deed and tucked it safely back into her pocket. We're saying you're not the first poor soul they've brought out here with a fancy new deed and a pocket full of false hope. The words hit Wade like a punch to the gut. Not the first. He felt a wave of nausea. His life savings. Gone. For a piece of paper that was worth less than the ink it was printed on. Sadie nodded grimly, confirming his fears. 2 weeks ago, a family from back east showed up. A man, his wife, 2 little kids. They had papers just like yours. Said they'd bought the place sight unseen, paid cash just like you probably did. We felt sorry for them, but we had to send them packing, same as we're doing with you. But, Sadie continued, leaning in conspiratorially, they mentioned something before they left. Something the bank told them that made our blood run cold. Wade dismounted slowly from his horse, his legs feeling unsteady, as if they might buckle beneath him. He was no longer a landowner confronting squatters. He was a victim standing with other victims, staring into the abyss of a crime far larger than he could have imagined. What? He asked, his voice hoarse. What did they say? Ruby, Sadie, and Clarabelle exchanged a look. It was a glance that spoke volumes, of shared secrets, of deep-seated fear, of a horror they had been living with. When Ruby finally turned back to him, her face was pale, and her voice was barely a whisper, a ghost of a sound that sent a chill down Wade's spine. They said the bank told them not to worry about the previous owners, she whispered. They told them the Callahan sisters had died, all 3 of us, burned alive in our beds in a terrible fire last winter. Wade's blood turned to ice. He was looking at 3 ghosts, 3 women who, according to the official story being peddled by Frontier Bank, were supposed to be dead and buried. The sheer cold-blooded audacity of it was staggering. It wasn't just fraud. It was a monstrous lie, a calculated effort to erase these women from existence so their home could be sold off. He stared at Ruby, at Sadie, at Clarabelle, standing there before him, very much alive and radiating an angry, defiant energy. The pieces of the terrible puzzle were no longer just falling into place. They were slamming together with the force of a locomotive. They told people you were dead, he said slowly, the words feeling foreign and grotesque in his mouth. They declared you dead, and all the while you're out here, living on your own land. And they're selling it, over and over again, to anyone with cash. Ruby nodded, her expression grim and hard as granite. Now you're starting to understand. Now you see the kind of snakes we're dealing with. The question is, mister, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to be like the others, tuck your tail between your legs and ride away? Or are you going to help us fight? Wade ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair, his mind reeling. The anger was coming now, a hot, surging tide. He'd been played for a fool. His dream, the farm he'd planned to build into a legacy, was a mirage. I gave them everything I had, he said, his voice thick with fury. $500, my entire savings. If your deed is the real one, and I'm starting to believe it is, then I've been robbed just as much as you have. More than you think, Clarabelle said quietly, her voice gaining a sliver of confidence. Show him, Sadie. Sadie, who seemed to be the keeper of their evidence, disappeared back into the house. She returned a moment later carrying a worn leather satchel. She didn't say a word, just pulled out a sheaf of papers and spread them out on the porch railing like a grim display. These are copies, Sadie explained, her finger tracing the text on one of the documents. We found them blowing around the edge of town after that big windstorm last month. They must have blown out of a trash fire behind the bank. We found 5 of them. Wade stepped closer, his boots heavy on the dirt. He examined the documents one by one. They were all deeds, just like his, for 5 different properties, scattered across 3 counties, all sold by Frontier Bank in the last 6 months, all to different buyers. But as he looked closer, a disturbing pattern emerged. "Look at the signatures," he murmured, pointing at the name of the bank manager, Harrison, at the bottom of each deed. The handwriting was identical, the same flamboyant, flourishing script on each one. But the properties, that's where the scam revealed itself in its full, sickening scope. "They sold the old Morrison Ranch to 3 different families in the same week," Sadie said, her voice a low, angry growl. "2 of them showed up on the same day. There was a gunfight. A man was killed. The sheriff wrote it off as a tragic misunderstanding. The old Henderson place down by the creek," Clarabelle added, pointing to another deed. "It's been sold 5 times since the spring. Every time a new buyer shows up, the Hendersons run them off with shotguns. But the bank just keeps their money and finds another fool a month later." It was a confident scheme, a massive, horrifyingly effective land-grabbing machine. Wade's anger was now boiling over into a cold, hard resolve. "They're taking money from folks like me," he said, thinking of the family with the 2 small children, "while they steal the land from people like you. They create chaos and conflict. When the new buyers show up and find the properties are already occupied, what happens then?" Ruby's expression darkened, her eyes reflecting a deep, weary sadness. "Most folks do what the others who came here did. They turn around and leave rather than get into a fight. They figure they got swindled, chalk it up to bad luck, and they're too ashamed or too broke to do anything about it. The bank keeps their money, keeps the land on its fake books, and just starts the cycle all over again with the next victim. But some buyers, some don't give up so easy," Clarabelle added, her voice barely a whisper. "Some try to force us out. They come back with friends." "That's when things get dangerous," Sadie finished, her hand once again drifting toward the gun on her hip. Wade felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't just happening here. It was a plague spreading across the territory. "How many people have they done this to?" "More than you'd think," Sadie replied. "And it's getting worse. The bank's gotten bold, arrogant, selling the same properties over and over in a matter of weeks. They must be making a fortune off of nothing but lies and forged papers." As she spoke, a small cloud of dust on the distant horizon caught Wade's eye. It was far down the road that led to town, a single rider, approaching fast. There was an urgency to his pace, a relentless forward motion that sent a fresh jolt of alarm through Wade's system. Something was wrong. "Expecting company?" he asked, his voice low. Ruby followed his gaze, and all the color drained from her face. Her expression went from defiant anger to sudden stark fear. "No," she breathed. "That's Jed Collins. He rides for the bank. He's their muscle. He only comes out here when there's trouble." The rider was closer now, close enough for them to see his face. It was a grim, determined mask. He wasn't coming for a friendly chat. He pulled his horse up hard in front of the house, the animal lathered with sweat and breathing heavily. He didn't bother to dismount, staying in the saddle as a way to loom over them. "Miss Callahan," Jed Collins called out, his voice flat and cold. His eyes flickered over Wade, dismissing him as an irrelevance. "The bank manager, Mr. Harrison, needs to see you in town. Today. Says it's about your property taxes." Ruby's hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. "I've told you people before. We don't owe any taxes. We own this land outright." Jed's lips twisted into a cruel, predatory smile. "The bank says different. The bank has records, and they say you've got till sundown to pay up, or you forfeit the land." Wade suddenly understood. This wasn't a coincidence. The bank knew he was here. They had sold him the property, and then just 3 days later, they were sending an enforcer to evict the sisters under a false pretense. They were pitting their victims against each other, and the trap was just about to spring. Wade didn't hesitate. He instinctively moved, stepping forward to position himself between Jed Collins and the 3 sisters. His hand didn't go to his gun, not yet, but it fell naturally to his side, his fingers brushing against the worn leather of his gun belt. It was a subtle gesture, but a clear one. He was in this now. The timing of Jed's visit felt too perfect, too calculated. It was a trap, and they had all walked right into it. Funny thing about that, Wade said, his voice deceptively calm and steady, a stark contrast to the tension coiling in his chest like a snake. I just bought this property from your bank 3 days ago. Seems mighty strange they'd be sending you to collect taxes on a piece of land they don't even own anymore. Jed's smug, confident expression faltered. Just for a second, a flicker of confusion, of surprise crossed his face before he managed to smother it. Wade saw it, and it was all the confirmation he needed. Jed hadn't known he was here. Harrison had sent his enforcer out to lean on the sisters, probably expecting them to be alone and easily intimidated. Wade's presence was an unexpected complication. "You must be mistaken, friend," Jed stammered, his eyes darting from Wade to the sisters and back again. "This here is Callahan property, and it's been delinquent on taxes for months. The books say so." "Is that so?" Wade shot back, his voice hardening. He pulled his own freshly minted deed from his coat pocket, the paper still crisp. He let it unfold with a snap. "Then maybe you can explain why this piece of paper says I own it now. Signed and sealed by your boss, Mr. Harrison himself." The color drained from Jed's face as he stared at the document. Wade could practically see the gears grinding in the man's head as he tried to process this new information, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. His simple intimidation tactic had just become incredibly complicated. Ruby, sensing the shift in power, stepped forward, her own ancient deed still clutched in her hand like a sacred text. "And while you're at it," she said, her voice ringing with newfound confidence, "you can ask Mr. Harrison to explain how he can sell property that already belongs to us. This deed's been in our family for 24 years. It's seen 2 governors and a whole lot of liars like you." Jed's horse stamped nervously, picking up on the rising tension. The rider was clearly rattled. His eyes darted between Wade's gun, the 3 resolute women, and the 2 conflicting deeds. He was a bully and a thug, used to dealing with scared, isolated people. He was out of his depth, and he knew it. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "Look," he finally spat out, his voice tight with frustration. "I'm just a messenger. I'm just following my orders. The bank wants its money by sundown, or there will be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Sadie demanded, stepping forward to stand beside Ruby. Her hand was no longer hovering near her belt. It was resting firmly on the butt of the pistol tucked into it. "The kind that happen when people don't pay their debts," Jed replied, his voice taking on a menacing, threatening tone as he tried to regain control. "The sheriff's been real understanding about property disputes lately, especially when it comes to squatters who refuse to leave land that's been rightfully purchased." The threat was clear. They would use Wade's own deed, the fraudulent one, as the legal justification to bring the law down on the sisters' heads. They would paint the Callahans as the criminals. Wade's anger, which had been simmering, finally boiled over. "Squatters!" he roared, the word exploding from him. "These women have been living on this land, their land, for 20 years. And I've got papers saying I bought this place fair and square. Seems to me the only criminal here is your boss. Your bank's been playing fast and loose with the truth, with people's lives, and with the law." Jed's hand twitched, moving instinctively toward his own gun. But Wade was faster. He didn't draw. He didn't need to. He simply shifted his weight, dropping into a slight crouch, his hand now hovering directly over the handle of his Colt. It was the subtle, practiced move of a man who knew how to use a gun, a man who wasn't afraid of a fight. The message was sent, and it was received loud and clear. Jed's hand froze. "I'd think real careful about your next move," Wade said, his voice now dangerously quiet, "because right now you're outnumbered 4-1, and every single one of us has a legitimate, bone-deep grievance against your employer." Just then, Clarabelle spoke up, her soft voice cutting through the thick, heavy tension like a knife. "Jed Collins," she said, and the use of his full name made him flinch. "You've known our family since we were children. You used to come out here with your father to buy eggs from our mother. You really think we're the kind of people who would squat on someone else's land?" For a fleeting moment, a flicker of uncertainty, of shame, crossed Jed's hardened features. He remembered. He remembered their mother. He remembered being a boy on this very farm, but that flicker was quickly extinguished, replaced by something harder, more desperate. Fear. Fear of his boss. "I got my orders," he said finally, his voice a low growl. He refused to look at Clarabelle. He looked at Wade. "And if you don't have that tax money by sundown, the sheriff himself is coming out here, and he'll have papers of his own, papers to clear every last one of you off this property." With that, he yanked hard on his horse's reins, wheeling the animal around. He spurred it brutally, sending it galloping back toward town, leaving a cloud of dust and a storm of unspoken threats hanging heavy in the air. Wade watched him go, his mind already churning, calculating. The threat was real. The deadline was sundown. He turned to Ruby. "How much?" he asked. "How much are they claiming you owe?" Ruby's answer felt like a punch to the gut, stealing the air from his lungs. $200, she said, her voice flat and defeated. $200. By tonight. $200. Wade stared at the horizon where Jed Collins had vanished, the dust from his horse just now beginning to settle. The amount was obscene. It was nearly half of what he had paid for the property in the first place. It was a fortune, an impossible sum designed to be impossible. It was money he no longer had. "We don't have that kind of cash," Ruby said, her voice as flat and hard as the dry packed earth beneath their feet. She was reading his thoughts, seeing the same dead end he was. "We never have. We grow our own food, we make our own clothes, we trade for what little we need in town. But $200 in cash? It might as well be 2,000. It might as well be the moon." Sadie kicked at a loose stone with the toe of her boot, her frustration a palpable force. "And even if we did have it," she spat, "paying them would be the stupidest thing we could do. It would be an admission of guilt. It would legitimize their fake claim. Next month, they'd be back wanting more. And the month after that." Wade nodded grimly, the gears of the trap becoming clearer and clearer. "And they'd keep bleeding you dry, a little at a time, until you had nothing left to give. Then they'd take the land anyway. The $200 isn't the point. The deadline is. They want you to fail." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the three women. Just an hour ago, he'd seen them as obstacles, as antagonists in his own story. Now they were his unexpected, and perhaps only, allies. A fierce, resilient family who had been fighting this silent war for months, maybe years. "How well do you know the people in town?" he asked. "Are there any honest folks who might help us?" "Well enough," Clarabelle answered softly. "Most folks have been decent to us over the years. Mr. Henderson at the general store, the blacksmith, they know us. But when it comes to going up against the bank," she trailed off, shrugging her shoulders in a gesture of helpless resignation. "The bank holds the mortgage on half the businesses in this town," Ruby explained, picking up where her sister left off. "People are scared. They're scared to cross Harrison, scared to lose their shops, their homes, and Sheriff Morrison, he owes his job to the bank's backing in last year's election. He's not the law. He's their private security." Wade felt the walls of the trap closing in, brick by suffocating brick. They were isolated, friendless, and running out of time. But something Jed had said, or rather, hadn't said, still bothered him. "Jed seemed awfully nervous when I showed him my deed," Wade thought aloud. "Genuinely surprised. Like he wasn't expecting me to be here at all. He came here to bully three women he thought were alone." "What are you thinking?" Sadie asked, her sharp eyes studying his face. "I'm thinking they're arrogant," Wade replied, a plan beginning to form in the chaos of his mind. "They're running so many scams at once, they can't keep their own lies straight. Harrison sent Jed on one errand, not knowing it would collide with his other scheme, the one involving me. They're not as organized as they want us to think, and maybe we can use that confusion, that nervousness, against them." Wade walked over to his horse, untied the reins, and swung himself into the saddle. The decision was made. "I'm riding to town," he announced. "I'm going to have a conversation with Mr. Harrison at the bank. Face to face." Ruby lunged forward and grabbed his horse's bridle, her eyes wide with alarm. "No, that's suicide. That's exactly what they want you to do. Get you alone, away from witnesses. Men have crossed Frontier Bank before and just disappeared. You can't go alone. Then come with me, Wade said simply, his gaze meeting hers. All of you. Let's force their hand. Let's see how brave Mr. Harrison feels when he has to explain his fraudulent paperwork and his contradictory stories in front of the whole town. The three sisters exchanged uncertain glances. It was a wildly dangerous gamble, but their other option was to wait for sundown, when the corrupt sheriff and his men would arrive to throw them off their land for good. Clarabelle was the first to speak. It's risky, she whispered. If we do nothing, we lose our home tonight anyway, Wade pointed out, his voice firm. At least this way, we go down fighting. At least this way, we might just drag them down with us. Ruby held his gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills and fears playing out between them. Finally, she gave a sharp, decisive nod. She released the bridle and stepped back. Give us 5 minutes to saddle up, she said. While the women disappeared into the barn to prepare their horses, Wade took the opportunity to study his own deed more carefully. He held it up to the afternoon sun. Something about it felt wrong. The ink looked fresh, too fresh. It hadn't fully soaked into the fibers of the paper. And the paper itself, while it had the yellowed, aged look of an official document, felt strange to the touch. It was stiff, not soft like Ruby's old deed. It felt like it had been artificially weathered, deliberately made to look old. Sadie emerged from the barn, leading a spirited chestnut mare, and saw him studying the document. You found something? Maybe. Wade held the deed up so she could see it in the light. This ink is barely dry. And look here. He pointed to Harrison's flourishing signature. The ink for the signature is a different shade of black than the rest of the document. It's darker, shinier. Clarabelle, mounting her own horse with a quiet grace, leaned over to look. They forged it, she breathed. They made your deed fresh, but tried to make it look old. Which means they're not just liars. They're sloppy liars, Ruby added, settling into her saddle with practiced ease. Mistakes like that suggest they're working fast. Maybe too fast. They're getting desperate. Wade folded the fraudulent deed carefully and tucked it back into his coat. It was worthless as a claim to the land, but as evidence, it was priceless. Or they're getting greedy, he said. Question is, why the rush now? The four of them, a strange and desperate alliance forged in fraud and defiance, started toward town at a steady pace. But Wade couldn't shake the chilling feeling that they weren't just riding to a confrontation. They were riding into a carefully prepared trap, and the bait was them. As they crested the last hill that overlooked the town, Wade pulled his horse up short, raising a hand to halt the others. Something's wrong, he said, his voice a low, grim whisper. Look at the bank. Too many horses. Below them, the main street of the small, dusty town looked quiet. Too quiet. But tied to the hitching rail outside the Frontier Bank were at least 6 horses. Not the usual farm horses or saddle-worn ponies of local ranchers. These were lean, powerful animals built for speed and distance. And there were far, far too many of them for a normal weekday afternoon. Ruby's face had gone pale. They were expecting us, she whispered, her voice tight with fear. The trap wasn't just being set. They were already in it. Wade studied the scene below. His eyes narrowed, every nerve ending screaming that this was an ambush. 6 horses meant at least 6 men, and honest men didn't gather at a bank in the middle of the afternoon unless serious trouble was brewing. We should turn back, Clarabelle whispered, her voice trembling. We can hide in the hills. No, Ruby said, her voice firm, though her face was still pale. She had a rifle resting across her lap, and her knuckles were white where she gripped it. If we run now, they'll just hunt us down. At least this way, we choose the ground. We face them on our own terms. Wade wasn't so sure. Those are riding horses, he said, his mind processing the details with military precision. Not town horses. Someone brought in hired guns. Professionals. Sadie pointed a shaky finger toward the other end of the street. Look there, Mrs. Patterson at the general store. She's closing up shop in the middle of the day. As they watched, the stout woman hurriedly slid a heavy wooden bar across her front door. And see how empty the street is? Word's gotten around. Everyone knows something is about to happen. She was right. The main street, which should have been bustling with afternoon trade, was nearly deserted. Shutters were drawn on the windows of the saloon and the blacksmith shop. The few people they could see were scurrying along with their heads down, pointedly avoiding looking in the direction of the bank or up the hill toward them. They're clearing the area, Wade realized with a sudden, chilling certainty. This wasn't just about collecting a fake tax debt. This wasn't about scaring them off. They want us gone. Permanently. As if on cue, the front doors of the bank swung open. A familiar figure emerged, his tin badge glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. It was Sheriff Morrison, but he wasn't alone. 3 other men followed him out, their hands resting casually, confidently on the holsters at their hips. They moved with a swagger, a predatory ease that marked them as men who made their living with violence. Professional gunfighters, Wade breathed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. And the sheriff's in their pocket, Ruby said bitterly. Just like we thought. He's not here to keep the peace. He's here to oversee an execution. One of the gunfighters looked up the hill, his eyes scanning the ridge. He saw them. He lifted his arm and pointed directly at their position. Wade cursed under his breath. They'd been spotted. The element of surprise, their only potential advantage, was gone. Time to go, he said, grabbing his reins. But before he could turn his horse, Ruby grabbed his arm. Wait, she hissed. Look who else is coming out. A tall man in an expensive dark city suit stepped onto the bank's porch. Even from this distance, Wade could see the man's air of absolute authority. The sheriff and the hired guns deferred to him, turning to him for instructions. This was the man in charge. That's not Harrison, Sadie said, her brow furrowed. I've never seen him before in my life. Clarabelle's face had gone bone white. A small, terrified sound escaped her lips. I have, she whispered, her voice barely audible. That's him. That's the man I saw at the trading post. The one who was meeting with the bank agent 3 months ago. The one who was laughing about selling our property. The pieces clicked together in Wade's mind with sickening clarity. This wasn't just a local scam run by a greedy bank manager. This was bigger. Much bigger. This operation has backing, he said grimly, from somewhere else. Somewhere with money and power. The stranger in the suit was now gesturing up the hill, giving sharp, clear orders to the sheriff and his hired guns. Whatever he was saying, it made the men spread out. 2 of them moved toward the livery stable at one end of town. The other 2, including the sheriff, took up positions near the alleyway by the blacksmith shop. They were blocking the main routes into and out of town. They're not planning to arrest us, Wade said, the cold truth dawning on him. They're planning to corner us, to box us in. Ruby's hand tightened on her rifle. Then we don't give them the chance to close the box. But as they wheeled their horses around to retreat back over the ridge, Wade spotted movement in the trees behind them. 2 more riders. They had come up from the north, silent as ghosts, cutting off their only escape route. The trap had closed. They were surrounded. Clarabelle, Wade said, his voice urgent. Is there another way down? Any other way? The old mining trail, Ruby said suddenly, her eyes scanning the rugged terrain to their right. Behind the church. It's steep, it's narrow, but it leads down to the canyon. If we can just reach it. A single gunshot cracked across the valley, the sound sharp and final. It echoed off the hills. It wasn't aimed at them. It was a signal. One of the riders behind them was letting the men in town know that the quarry was flushed and cornered. Wade's decision was made in an instant. Running and hiding was no longer an option. Their only chance was chaos. We ride, he yelled, his voice a command. We ride hard, straight through the main street. Right at them. They'll be expecting us to run away, not at them. Stay low, stay together, and don't stop for anything. He spurred his horse, Bess, digging his heels into her sides. She surged forward, a powerful bundle of muscle and adrenaline. The 3 sisters were right behind him, a storm of desperate courage. But as they thundered down the hill, straight toward the waiting guns, Wade knew they weren't just riding into a gunfight. They were riding into a massacre, and they were the targets. Wade leaned low over Bess's neck, the wind whipping past his ears, his world narrowed to the dusty main street rushing up to meet them. The men outside the bank scrambled for position, their faces a mixture of shock and grim determination. They had expected cornered animals, not a cavalry charge. That brief moment of surprise was the only advantage they had, and Wade intended to use it. "Stay right behind me," he shouted over his shoulder, the words torn away by the wind. They hit the edge of town like a thunderclap, hooves pounding a frantic rhythm against the hard-packed earth. The first gunshot rang out from the bank's porch. The bullet hissed past Wade's ear, so close he felt its heat. He didn't flinch. He drew his own Colt, the familiar weight of it a small comfort in the chaos. The sheriff and his hired guns were trying to spread out, to create a deadly crossfire, but their formation was ragged, broken by the sheer audacity of the direct assault. Behind him, Ruby's rifle cracked, a sharp, authoritative sound. One of the gunfighters, who had been leveling his pistol over a water trough, stumbled backward with a cry of pain, clutching a shattered shoulder. The brutal precision of her shot sent the others diving for cover behind porch posts and overturned barrels. They weren't just targets anymore. They were fighting back. They raced past the shuttered general store, the silent blacksmith shop, their horses' hooves striking sparks off the iron rails embedded in the street. Wade could see the tall white steeple of the church ahead, and just beyond it, the narrow dark gap between the buildings that marked the start of the mining trail. It was their only hope of salvation. But the man in the expensive suit was on the bank porch, shouting orders, his voice cutting through the gunfire. More men were emerging from the alleyways and doorways along the street. This wasn't just the sheriff and a few hired guns. It seemed like half the town was in on the conspiracy, armed and ready. A shot from an upstairs saloon window shattered the wooden sign above their heads, sending splinters raining down. Clarabelle's horse shied violently, screaming in terror, and nearly threw her. But she clung on with a desperate strength Wade wouldn't have thought she possessed, her face set in a mask of grim resolve. "The trail!" Ruby yelled, pointing with her rifle barrel toward the gap between the church and the old dilapidated mill. Wade veered right, leading them in a frantic, sliding turn off the main street. A concentrated volley of gunfire erupted from behind them, the bullets chewing up the dirt where they had just been. Wood splintered from the wall of the church, and dust flew as slugs slammed into the ground, but they were already past the worst of it, plunging into the narrow, shadowy path. The trail was little more than a goat path, twisting and climbing steeply into the rocky hills that loomed over the town. It was barely wide enough for a single horse, forcing them into a single file line. Wade took the lead, his eyes scanning the treacherous terrain ahead, while behind them, the sounds of shouting and the frantic saddling of horses told him a pursuit was already being organized. After 10 minutes of brutal, heart-pounding climbing, Wade finally called a halt in a small, hidden grove of pine trees. They were far enough away to risk a brief rest, and the horses desperately needed it, their sides heaving, their coats slick with sweat. "Everyone all right?" he asked, his gaze quickly checking each of the sisters for injuries. Sadie had a long, bloody graze on her forearm, where a bullet had torn through her sleeve. It looked painful, but superficial. The others were shaken, splattered with dirt and adrenaline, but miraculously unharmed. "They'll be coming after us," Ruby said, her chest still heaving as she tried to catch her breath. She was looking back down the trail toward the town, her eyes filled with a grim certainty. "And they know this country as well as we do. They won't give up." Wade nodded grimly. She was right. Running would only delay the inevitable. They couldn't outrun them forever in these hills. They needed to end this once and for all. But how? How could 4 people, with a handful of bullets and no allies, fight an entire corrupt organization that owned the law and had a seemingly endless supply of hired guns? It was hopeless. And that's when Clarabelle, quiet, timid Clarabelle, pulled something from her saddlebag that changed everything. "Before we left the house," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "when you were saddling the horses, I grabbed something. I thought we might need it." She held up a thick, oilskin-wrapped package. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it, revealing a thick, leather-bound ledger, its edges singed and blackened with soot. "These are the real bank record," she said, her eyes meeting Wade's. "The ones Mr. Harrison thought he burned last month." Wade stared at the book, his heart pounding a new rhythm of shock and dawning hope. How? How in God's name did you get those? A small, determined smile touched Clarabelle's lips for the first time that day. I used to clean the bank office for Mr. Harrison. Late at night, after they'd all gone home. About a month ago, I smelled smoke. I saw him out back, trying to burn a pile of books and papers. He thought he'd destroyed them all. She paused, her eyes gleaming with a secret pride. But the fire didn't take right. After he left, I snuck back. I pulled this ledger from the embers. It's burned, but you can still read most of it. With trembling fingers, Wade took the heavy book. He opened it. Inside, page after page was filled with Harrison's meticulous, flourishing script. It wasn't just a record of deposits and withdrawals. It was a secret diary of their entire criminal enterprise. Real deeds listed next to the dates they were forged. Correspondence with mysterious investors from back east, discussing which properties to target next. And most damning of all, a detailed ledger of payoffs. This is it, Wade breathed, his finger tracing a line of text. This is everything. Names, dates, amounts. They've been stealing property across 3 counties for over 2 years. Ruby leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the singed pages. Look at this entry here, she gasped. Payment to Judge Stevens for favorable rulings in property disputes. And this one, Sheriff Morrison, monthly retainer for protection services. Sadie pointed to another page, her face a mask of fury. They've got a list of properties they were planning to steal next. The Henderson spread, the old Murphy place, even the church land. The sound of approaching horses from further down the trail shattered their moment of discovery. The posse was closing in. Wade quickly stuffed the ledger back into the oilskin wrap and handed it to Ruby. His mind was racing, a desperate plan forming out of the chaos. How many trails lead out of these canyons? He asked Clarabelle. 3 main trails, she answered immediately, but only one leads north toward the territorial capital. The capital, that's where the real law was. The U.S. Marshals. We split up, he decided, his voice leaving no room for argument. We have to. Ruby, you take this ledger. You ride for the capital. Don't stop for anything. Find Marshal Davidson. I met him last year when he was passing through. He's a hard man, but he's honest. Show him this book. He turned to the other 2 sisters. Sadie, Clarabelle, you 2 know these hills better than anyone. You have to lead them on a wild goose chase. Keep them chasing shadows. Buy Ruby as much time as you can. Make them think all 4 of us are running together. What about you? Ruby asked, her green eyes wide with concern as she clutched the precious ledger to her chest. Wade checked the rounds in his Colt. He had 5 shots left. I'm going back to town, he said, his voice cold and hard as steel. It's time someone had a direct conversation with the man in the expensive suit. It was a desperate suicidal plan, but it was the only one they had. The plan was madness, but madness was all they had left. While the hired guns and the corrupt sheriff thundered through the canyons, chasing the phantom trail laid by Sadie and Clarabelle, Wade slipped back toward town. He moved like a ghost, using the deep shadows of the canyons and the thick stands of pine to conceal his approach. He abandoned Bess, knowing a horse would be too loud, and made the last mile on foot, circling around to the east and coming in through the old, neglected cemetery. The town was eerily silent. Most of the population was still hiding indoors, barricaded behind locked doors, terrified of the violence that had erupted in their street. Wade crept through the tombstones, using them for cover, until he reached the back of the church. From there, it was a short, heart-pounding dash across an empty lot to the alleyway behind the bank. He found what he was looking for. The back door to the bank office was ajar. Through the grimy window, he could see him, the stranger from back east, the man Clarabelle had identified, the man in the expensive suit who commanded sheriffs and gunfighters. He was alone, frantically stuffing stacks of money and papers into a large leather satchel. He was getting ready to run. Wade drew his Colt, eased the back door open, and stepped inside. The soft click of the door latch made the man spin around, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Going somewhere? Wade asked, his voice a low growl. The barrel of his gun was trained squarely on the man's chest. The man's composure, his air of untouchable authority, shattered like glass. Fear flashed in his eyes, raw and undisguised. "You," he stammered. "How? They said they had you cornered." "Your men are chasing ghosts in the canyons," Wade said, taking a slow step into the room. The office was a mess of overturned chairs and scattered papers, the scene of a panicked departure. "Looks like you were planning on leaving them behind to take the fall." The man, Jonathan Kessler, as Wade would later learn his name was, slowly raised his hands. A slick, oily smile spread across his face as he tried to regain control. "Look, cowboy," he said, his voice smooth and persuasive. "You're clearly a man of talents. There's no need for this to end in violence. That satchel is full of cash, more money than you've ever seen. Take it. It's yours. Just ride away and forget you ever saw this town. Or me." "The time for bribes is over," Wade said, his voice flat. "This is about stolen land, ruined lives. It's about three sisters you tried to erase." Kessler's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer of contempt. "Those ignorant farm women? You're throwing your life away for them? You don't understand the forces you're dealing with. This isn't just about some backwater bank. This is about progress. The railroad is coming through this territory. My associates, the men I work for back in Chicago and New York, they need this land cleared. All of it. They have governors in their pockets, senators. You're not fighting me, you fool. You're fighting the future." He was confessing, spilling the entire conspiracy, confident that Wade would never live to repeat it. "You had backing," Wade corrected, taking another step closer. "Past tense. Because right now, about a day's ride from here, a woman named Ruby Callahan is handing a very interesting, smoke-damaged ledger to a U.S. Marshal. A ledger that names every one of your powerful investors, every official you've bought, every property you've stolen, and every dollar you've paid out in bribes." The color drained from Kessler's face. He stared at Wade, his mind visibly racing, processing the horrifying implications. "That's impossible," he whispered, his voice cracking. "We destroyed all the records. I watched Harrison burn them myself." "You missed one," Wade said with grim satisfaction. "Seems a quiet girl who cleans your offices has a habit of saving things from the fire." In that moment, Kessler's desperation boiled over into rage. With a guttural scream, he lunged not at Wade, but at the heavy oak desk beside him. He heaved it over, sending it crashing to the floor between them, and dove for a shotgun that had been propped against the wall. But Wade was ready. He fired a single shot, not at Kessler, but into the floorboards right in front of the man's feet. The roar of the Colt was deafening in the small office. Wood splintered and Kessler cried out, stumbling back from the blast. The front doors of the bank burst open. Sheriff Morrison and one of the hired guns stood there, their guns drawn, their faces grim. "It's over, Langston," the sheriff snarled. "Drop it." Wade was trapped, but then another sound. The thunder of approaching horses, lots of them, coming hard. Sheriff Morrison's face went from triumph to confusion. He glanced out into the street. His jaw dropped. Riding into town wasn't just a single U.S. Marshal. It was Marshal Davidson, all right, but he was flanked by a dozen heavily armed federal agents, their rifles at the ready. Ruby rode beside him, her face tired but triumphant, pointing directly at the bank. The game was over. Within hours, the entire criminal enterprise unraveled. The agents, armed with the undeniable proof in the ledger, moved with ruthless efficiency. Jonathan Kessler was arrested, his expensive suit covered in dust as he was hauled away in handcuffs. Sheriff Morrison was stripped of his badge on the spot, his blustering protest silenced by the cold steel of a federal warrant. Bank manager Harrison, found hiding in the cellar of his home, was dragged out, weeping and begging for mercy. The hired guns, including a wounded Jed Collins, were rounded up in the canyons and arrested without a fight. The forged deeds were all declared invalid. The stolen money was recovered from hidden accounts in banks back east. A federal investigation, reaching all the way to Chicago, began to untangle the web of corrupt investors and politicians. Dozens of families across 3 counties, who had been swindled and intimidated, had their land and their money returned to them. Wade got his $500 back, plus damages awarded by the court. More importantly, the Callahan sisters' ownership of their family land was officially confirmed, certified, and recorded with the territorial government, ironclad and untouchable forever. 3 months later, Wade Langston stood on the porch of the farmhouse. It was his home now, a home he shared with Ruby, Sadie, and Clarabelle. Not as an owner, but as a partner, as family. He had invested his return money into new equipment, better seed, and a small herd of cattle. And together, the four of them were building something better and stronger than any of them could have achieved alone. Ruby stepped out of the house, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, a warm smile on her face. "Supper's ready," she said. Wade smiled back, watching Sadie expertly training a new colt in the corral, while Clarabelle tended to a garden that was now twice its original size. It had taken a vast and terrible conspiracy to bring them all together, but it was trust, courage, and hard work that had forged them into a family. The land was safe. The criminals were behind bars. And for the first time in a very long time, Wade Langston was truly home. If you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure. And if you have a story about a time when the underdog came out on top, share it with us down in the comments below. We read every single one. Thanks for watching.